Welcome to Beyond the Red Carpet. We have a very special guest, someone that viewers already know, Mr. Ivor Davis, because he's here to talk about 50 years ago. The music world was rocked by the dissolution of the Beatles. And I'd like to welcome Ivor to the show, back again, because you had an intimate relationship, not sexually, of course, but an intimate relationship with the Beatles, and you have insights to share about what happened 50 years ago.
Yes. Hello, Francine. Welcome to the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, this is
Sorry. We have to make some reference to what is going on outside, but I always used to say, well, normal service will be resumed in our lives when, Francine? Take a guess.
this Corona crap is gone.
Yes. But all right, so let me just give you a quick Beatle update. I mean, I knew, and a lot of people who are around the Beatles knew, that things were coming to an end. Because first of all, John had talked about it, and then Paul had talked about it. But the most important thing that happened was a couple of years earlier, Brian Epstein died. He died from a accidental, who knows, drug overdose. Once he was the rudder, he was the captain of the Beatles ship. Whenever the Beatles had controversies and arguments, Brian came in and solved them. So once he was gone, the other Beatles didn't want to perform live anymore because, as John once told me, I hope I'm not going on too long. John once told me that, we've become a bunch of performing fleas. He said people come to see us and not to hear our music. So they wanted to get off the tour circuit. And then the others, George and Ringo, particularly George, wanted to strike out on his own as an entertainer. Believe it or not, he wanted to be an ex-Beatle.
So George was the one that really wanted a solo career more than the others?
He wanted it very much, very, very much so. And Ringo, well, I think he was happy to be behind the drums. But you've got to realize that there was a little bit of a rift between Paul and John Lennon. And the other key thing that any Beatle fan knows was there was a lady called Yoko Ono who came to the party and stayed. And she came to the party. She came to the recordings at Abbey Road, and the Beatles were absolutely PO'd because all of a sudden John brings along this strange Asian lady, and he tells the Beatles, well, she's part of me, and wherever I go, she goes. And the Beatles were not very happy to hear that. So there was a multitude of reasons why the divorce came about. And of course, 50 years ago now, the world learned there was never going to be the Beatles anymore. It was together, that is, of course, because now, as we talk in 2020, Paul is still touring, Ringo is still touring, but the Beatles never came together at the same place at a concert. They did come together on the rooftop in Abbey Road, but there wasn't really a massive concert. So there were all these things that were happening.
Prior to this, how long had John known Yoko before he brought her to the recording session?
Probably for about maybe a year. So she was a new girl on the block, and Yoko is not the kind of woman who sits back shyly and says nothing. So when John shows up with Yoko at a recording session, the Beatles say, "Who the hell is she?" And then she starts telling John what to do and how to do it. And so that widens the rift enormously. But
I had an interview with Yoko one time.
Well, tell me what she said.
I don't know. How can you understand what she says? It's not her accent. She just her mind is so, I guess, because she's an artist, she just was had some convoluted ways of thinking and expressing herself. So it was a little unusual to speak with her. But go ahead, continue your story.
No, no, I mean, I think so. I mean, also I mean, John was totally besotted by this woman. And, you know, the marriage itself had its ups and downs, as most of us know, because I remember meeting John in Los Angeles in the 70s when Yoko sent John to LA with May Pang, who was a kind of a partner, a secretary, a lover. And so, I mean, Yoko thinks out of the box, and that's what John liked. John was definitely an out of the box kind of guy. So there you have a situation where the marriage of the Beatles is breaking down severely for the reasons that I explained, and Yoko comes into the mix. I don't think she caused them to break up because, as I said a moment ago, Francine, they were ready to strike out on their own. So that happened. And one other key factor in this whole mess was the fact that Paul had teamed up with Linda Eastman's father and brother and decided they were going to manage his life. And John brought in a pit bull of a manager called Alan Klein. And so, I mean, it's like a terrible divorce. The lawyers don't get along. The principals don't get along. It's he said, she said, they said, and it was a mess. And so to those of us who were kind of keeping tentacles on what was going on, it didn't surprise us that they were going their separate ways, and they went their separate ways eventually.
But each one of them has had their own career, a single career. And then periodically, like nowadays, Paul and Ringo joined together. And of course, the other two are no longer living. But who do you think had the best post-Beatle career?
Well, it's interesting because in the days that I traveled with the Beatles, which was 64, 65, 66 in the 20th century, Ringo didn't get many songs. George got tossed a morsel or two. And I knew from Derek Taylor, who was the Beatles press secretary and was very close to George Harrison, that George felt that he was shortchanged on the singing. So each of them definitely wanted to go their own way. And in fact, one of the times I saw George, he was traveling on his own with the album. I forget the name of the album. I'm sorry, I should have remembered it. But he was in America with Derek Taylor doing a George Harrison tour without the Beatles. Now, I will tell you one other thing, which is kind of interesting. When I spoke to John in Los Angeles for his Lost Weekend, which lasted 18 months when he was with May Pang and Yoko was in New York, John said that he'd met Muhammad Ali at a political party, and it could have been, well, for one of the presidential candidates, and that Muhammad Ali said, John, if you can get the Beatles back together again, I'll produce the show. I mean, that's Muhammad Ali for you. But of course, it was a great idea, but it never happened. And nobody, and I think there were many efforts to bring the Beatles back together again, but sadly, it didn't happen. Now, you know, when you look at it, it would have been great because I'm sure you probably saw the Rolling Stones on that One Globe or One World video that they did recently, and the Stones are together again. Well, with a few exceptions. So it would have been incredible if the Beatles had come back for reunion concerts, but it never happened. It never happened.
Something for history. That would have been something. Now, at the time that Yoko came in, was Paul with Linda at the time?
Yeah, Paul, I mean, here was the thing. Paul was already with Linda, and I think Paul was either about to marry Linda or had married Linda because all of a sudden Linda's father, who was a bright entertainment lawyer, and Linda's brother, also in the same legal business, said to Paul, hey, Paul, you know, you don't have that much money. You should get control of your own music. You should do this and you should do that. And Paul saw that the wisdom of the Eastmans and their knowledge was valuable. And so he globbed onto them, and that was the Paul McCartney Eastman team against the John Lennon Alan Klein team. Well, you know, I mean, it got rather dirty because Alan Klein was quite a scrapper, and so there was no way they could have kissed and made up. I don't think so. Not with the makeup of their lawyers.
So during this time, it was mainly Paul and John and their teams that were butting heads, and Ringo and George were kind of.
Well, Ringo and George felt they were kind of left out of it. They weren't the chief contenders in this whole thing, and they felt a bit in the cold, and so they decided, well, to hell with you guys, we're going to do our own thing. And then they started looking for fresh musical avenues, and that's what happened. They all did, and as you know today, Ringo tours with his all-star band. Paul tours with his incredible 3-hour show in which Paul performs for 3 hours non-stop on stage. So they're not short of a few shillings, as I like to say at the moment.
Are they, well, Ringo lives here, I believe, in California.
Ringo is in LA.
Yes.
Paul has homes in LA, Scotland, London, New York, the Hamptons, where he is currently. Yeah, he's currently in the Hamptons, trying to stay out of the public eye because of the craziness that we are going through at this particular time.
I was thinking when I knew you were coming on, I was thinking, wow, if the Beatles were still all alive and they were sequestered together during this amazing Corona crisis, what music they would have come up with that would have been absolutely amazing. It
is. I mean, this is a time that all of us have never experienced in our lives, unless people who were around for the 1918 or 1915 plague, round about there. So
yeah.
You're right. You know, would they have? I mean, I think what's happening, and you can correct me, Francine, is that at a time like this, when the planet stands still in a strange way, that you do reach out to your friends, your family, even more so than you would normally do when you're caught up in the 24-hour craziness that most people live. So you're right. It's an interesting thing to say, if all the Beatles were alive, you know, they probably would have come together for a coronavirus reunion concert. I'm serious, now that you're bringing it up.
I believe that, knowing how they felt about the world and their humanity concerns. I believe that. I did see there's, I don't know if it's on Netflix now or what, George Harrison documentary about him and his religious influence. Yeah. And he didn't really, I don't recall him really mentioning his time with the Beatles during that. I think he was just felt completely a separate entity at that time in his life, towards the end of his life. What do you think?
Well, yeah, you know, in a way, George did try to say that was a chapter of my life, and now I'm in a new chapter of the George Harrison world. Mm-hmm. But I think, I mean, it's a bit like someone trying to reject their childhood or their formative years. You can't do it because it is so. I mean, it forms you as a human being. So whatever George wanted to do, and he did a lot. I mean, the whole Indian transcendental Maharishi stuff, which he sucked the Beatles into doing for a while. So there's no doubt that George was quite happy doing his own thing, but you still realize, you know, I mean, if you want to reject your parents, you still have to say, well, they're my parents. I mean, you know what I mean. The Beatles, right. My family, they were George's family. They will always be, and they always continue to be. And the same with the others. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the program, Francine, that in LA about 5-6 months ago, Ringo showed up at Paul McCartney's concert in LA on stage, which was terrific. So, I mean, there is such a kinship between them, because when I was on the road with them, I thought they were like one gigantic brain. I mean, they could finish each other's punchlines. They could tell. They were like, I don't know, they were like switched at birth, or whatever the hell that phrase is. If you know
Well,
what I mean.
yeah, they were connected.
They were connected. Sense of humor, roots, Liverpool roots, all that stuff. They were grown up in the same fodder, or the same house, or the same neighborhood.
Yes. Well, and also they did show the concert for George about the commemorative concert put on by George's son and widow. And at that time, the Beatles did come. I mean, the remaining Beatles were there to celebrate George. So you felt at that time that they really had a kinship, no matter if they were separated or not. They really felt that between them, they were a unit.
Francine, they were and always will be blood brothers. There's no doubt. And it's a bit like, as I say, a feuding family. If you can bring them together, if you can make peace, or you can get a shrink to bring them together. They knew. I mean, they began in the same melting pot. So, I mean, that's why that George Harrison concert was so good, because everybody showed up. I mean, they were all part of the family, and that's what happens. You mentioned that documentary on George Harrison, which I actually haven't seen, but I did see an interesting documentary, and it touches upon the Beatles. And I was always fascinated about Eric Clapton's relationship with George Harrison, and there was a good documentary.
Switched their wives, didn't they?
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, there it is. So it's like, I mean, it was so weird. I mean, Pattie Boyd was married to George, and then she wasn't, and then she was married to Eric Clapton. So
they're best friends. Yes, it's.
I mean, it was kind of I don't know, gentle wife swapping, or whatever you want to call it.
That's a crazy story in itself. That really is a crazy story. But Eric Clapton, who had married George's wife, was at this concert for George, and it's. I guess you think of it as a little incestuous, but it's not really. But it's just that the relationships are. I guess in the music world, you have to have a different mentality to be that creative, and that's what they were, very creative, all of them.
Yeah, I mean musicians sometimes forget their grievances and come together. I mean, what is amazing, and I know we're not talking about the Rolling Stones, is the fact that Mick Jagger today has kept the Stones together. He is the king of the kingdom. I mean, the Rolling Stones don't, I know this from a friend of mine who was very close to the Stones, even today, that Mick is the kind of the kingmaker. So if that had happened to the Beatles, that would have been an interesting story. But Mick Jagger looks after his own, and is still performing. And I know we're talking about the Beatles, but there's a perfect example of a family who did not disintegrate. I mean, they all had their own terrible problems with deaths and suicides and what have you. But anyway, but the Stones are a good example of a family that still talk to each other.
Well, let me ask you, because you knew these guys personally. I know you said before Yoko joined that recording session that they were kind of on the verge of splitting up. Do you think, had Yoko not come into the picture, that they would have stayed together at least another few years?
I believe that it wouldn't have made much difference. It might have lasted maybe another year or so, But even before Yoko showed up, there was breaks in the family. There was disputes about all sorts of things. It's like a marriage that goes along well for a while, and then suddenly there are strains from within. And as I said a moment ago, Ringo said this, and George said they don't give me enough credit, and Paul and John say, well, we probably write most of the songs, and so why should we? And then, of course, John was so strong-willed, and Paul had the advice of the Eastman family, and realized that he had to butter his bread nicely and look after himself. So all these, and they were changing personalities, and that's what happens in any marriage sometimes. Some marriages last a long time. Many marriages last a long time. But the Beatles, with or without Yoko, to answer your question, would still have split up, in my opinion.
Well, they had such strong creative personality, I believe, each one of them. And I don't think they would have stayed together. If they were to stay together, they wouldn't have lasted like the Rolling Stones. They just couldn't. They were too strong, independent, and too creative. Each one of them had their own creativeness. I don't know the words, but they had their drive. And to stay together would have really imploded them personally, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right. They would have imploded anyway, because they were strong. They were all four different personalities. And as I said, Ringo felt that he was sometimes left out in the cold. George wanted to be more creative. George said, is that all there is to life? And that's why he went a bit hog wild on the Maharishi. The Beatles did please him by going to India with him, and that didn't quite work out as well as they thought. So, when you grow older, don't forget there were kids, well, virtual kids when they teamed up. And all of us, whether it's you or me or anybody, we change as we grow older, hopefully for the better.
Who do you in your experience with them, who was the clown of the group? Who was the funniest one that if you were just in a party with one of them, which one would you have chosen?
I think John was always the most lively, the most not tantrum filled, but he was the provocateur. He liked to needle you. He liked to start an argument. He liked to make crazy provocative statements. Paul was always the more PR oriented, easygoing guy. Look, last year I went back to San Diego and went backstage to talk to Paul. And Paul was humorous, friendly. This was before the show. I would have thought he was on tenterhooks. It was on, as they say in Ireland, he was on spilkers.
Yes.
But he wasn't. He chatted. He was going to do a 3-hour concert. So Paul was always the more easygoing, on the outside type of guy. Ringo also has evolved, of course, as we all have to as we grow older. And George evolved as a musician in his own right, and he brought this sitar, and what was the name of the great sitar player that he teamed up with?
Yes. Oh, don't ask me names right now.
It'll come to us in 10 minutes. But
yes.
So he and George experimented, and George liked the idea that he was striking out as George Harrison and not Beatle George Harrison.
Do you think George was the most sensitive of them?
I don't know. Sensitive is a difficult word. They were all sensitive in their own way. George was the least sociable of the crowd. George would not, when there were fools in the room, he showed his aggravation. He didn't go gently with them. and Ringo was at that time, in the time that I knew him, was also a little bit, well, Ringo was kind of, gee whiz, isn't this fantastic? But then, of course, when you get older, you realize, yeah, sure, it's fantastic, but I have to keep social distancing. Ringo was doing social distancing, if you remember, before it became a hot phrase. And I mean, he wouldn't shake hands, he would bump elbows and stuff like that. So he was ahead of the game.
Yeah.
But they all evolved.
How old is Ringo now? Do you know?
Well, Ringo's got to be. I'm older than Ringo, and Ringo hasn't quite hit 80, so he's pushing it close.
And Paul.
Him and did I see Barbara Streisand this year? Is today, as we talk, is 70.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Don't ask Barbara, but that's another story.
Okay, let's go back to the implosion of the Beatles, the divorce.
Yeah.
That hit the world, not just the music industry, but the fans so hard. Do you remember all the outcries around the world of when was the official notification that the Beatles were no longer the Beatles?
Well, there had been a few stories, and so those who followed the passions and the madness of the Beatles knew something sad was afoot. But I suppose 50 years ago, as we are talking this month, was when the official announcement came out from, I think it was from Paul, although John had told a writer a few months earlier that the marriage was over. And so anybody that was following the whole Apple thing, their recording stuff, some of the crazy movies that they made after Help and after Hard Day's Night, knew that it was falling apart. And as I said at the beginning of our conversation, Francine, their rock, their decider, their whatever, Brian Epstein, was gone, and so there was nobody to fill that void, and so nobody could be the adjudicator, the judge, and so they grew steadily apart until the official announcement, and they were complaining. The Beatles were complaining to each other that they'd sold the music, given the music away, and all that sort of stuff. So there was. It's like a marriage, as I said at the beginning. There are a multitude of little things that build up to the final deadly, awful explosion.
Yes. Well, I do remember the cries and from on the news about women, and especially in music fans, just being totally blown away by the fact that they wouldn't have their Beatles anymore. And what was your personal feeling when you heard it was final, it was it? What was your personal feeling knowing that you knew each one of them?
Well, the funny thing was that when they finally broke up, I mean, I didn't shed tears. I mean, I was a journalist covering big stories from day to day. And to be perfectly honest with you, Francine, I thought, well, rock groups come and rock groups go. But it wasn't until much later that we become wise and we realize what a historical group they were. I just went on and thought, well, that's showbiz.
Yeah, that's true, and that's the way it goes, as they say. But thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it, and we're going to see you again in another couple months. I know the fans, the viewers, really enjoy hearing your stories. And for those of you watching this show, I will see you next time when we take another look beyond the red carpet. Thanks, Ivor.
Thank you, Francine, and stay well.